In the English countryside of 1889, a young woman named Eleanor Whitmore was handed over by her own father to a powerful widowed landowner as part of a silent and shameful arrangement. What should have been the end of her dreams became, without either of them expecting it, the beginning of something neither knew they still needed. Richard Ashford, master of Ashford Manor, was a man of iron will and a sealed heart. Eleanor was a woman of invisible dignity and stubborn hope. Between them, the ideal distance of two worlds. And yet, something began to stir in that quiet and severe estate with the same stubbornness with which grass grows through the cracks in a stone wall. If you enjoy intense and redemptive love stories, subscribe to our channel. We publish new stories every week. Leave a like if this story touches your heart, and tell us in the comments where you're joining us from today. The August heat arrived early in that part of the country. Before the sun had finished rising over the hills, it could already be felt on one's shoulders, on the back of the neck, in the eyes. Eleanor knew this because she had spent years waking before dawn, when the house was still asleep, and she could have, for an hour at least, the illusion that the world belonged to her. She rose without making a sound. She folded the blanket carefully, though no one had asked her to. She washed her face with the cold water from the basin she left, prepared the night before. She braided her hair in front of the small, foggy mirror that hung crookedly on the wall of her room, a room that had once been the sewing room. When her mother died, her father had converted it into Eleanor's room, without asking, without explaining. He had simply moved her things there one afternoon and closed the door. That was what Arthur Whitmore did with the things he didn't want to see. He put them somewhere they wouldn't be in the way. Eleanor was 16 when that happened. Now she was 23, and the sewing room was still her room. The difference was that it no longer hurt in quite the same way. Or perhaps it did still hurt, but she had learned not to touch the wound. The Whitmore house sat on the outskirts of the village, on a dirt lane lined with old oak trees. It was not a poor house, but neither was it a prosperous one. It was a house that lacked things: a hinge on the kitchen window, paint on the front wall, the joy it had held when Constance had been alive. Eleanor's mother had been a woman of easy laughter and always busy hands. She made preserves in summer, embroidered in winter, sang without noticing while she kneaded bread. With her, the house had had a pulse. When she died of fever one November afternoon, the house became like a body without blood. Arthur didn't know how to respond to grief. He was a man who had been raised not to show what he felt, and what is not shown ends up rotting from within. What rotted in him was tenderness. What remained was rigidity, resentment, and an increasingly pronounced tendency to drink after supper. Catherine, the eldest daughter, married the following year. A man from another county, with land of his own and a respectable name. The wedding was subdued but sufficient, and Catherine left without looking back, with that ability some people have to release the past, as if it were a burden that didn't belong to them. Eleanor stayed. No one asked her to, not explicitly, but no one offered her another option either. Her father needed someone to cook, to wash, to keep the house standing. And she was there, as simple as that, as cruel as that. The years passed with that particular slowness of lives without great events. Eleanor learned to manage the house on little money. She learned to mend her father's clothes, to bargain with the butcher at the market, to preserve the garden's tomatoes so they would last through winter. She learned, above all, to take up as little space as possible, to make as little noise as possible, to ask for as little as possible. She was not unhappy in any visible way. She was unhappy in that dull and continuous way that produces no screams or scenes, but simply settles in one's chest and remains, like a weight one ends up considering part of oneself. She had friends, few of them. Rose, the blacksmith's daughter, who had married at 20 and now had 2 children with another on the way. Lydia, the village schoolteacher, single by choice and proud of it, who lent her books from time to time and with whom she took tea on Sundays when the weather permitted. And Reverend Edmund, who was not exactly a friend, but was a constant and good presence, a man of simple faith and unadorned kindness, who had known her since childhood and treated her with a consideration her own father rarely showed. It was a small life, but it was hers, or so she believed. The first time she heard the name Richard Ashford was a Tuesday in May, while she was peeling potatoes in the kitchen. Her father had come home, earlier than usual, with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite decipher at first. It wasn't his ordinary bad mood, nor his weariness. It was something different, a mixture of discomfort and resolve, like that of someone who has made a decision they know others won't like, but are prepared to stand by regardless. He sat at the table without removing his hat, which was unusual for him. He asked for water. Eleanor brought it. There was a silence. "I've spoken with Mr. Richard Ashford," said her father without looking at her. Eleanor kept peeling potatoes. "The landowner at Ashford Manor?" "The same." Another silence. The knife scraped the skin of the potatoes with a regular dry sound. "And," said Eleanor, because something in her father's tone told her there was more. Arthur removed his hat. He set it on the table. He ran a hand through his sparse, greying hair. And then he spoke, with that manner he had of saying difficult things, directly, without preamble, as though brevity were a form of responsibility. "I have arranged that you will go to live at his estate." The knife stopped. Eleanor raised her eyes slowly. She looked at her father. He held her gaze, but there was something in his eyes that was not quite firmness. It was more the look of someone who has already decided not to listen. "As his wife?" she asked, with a calm that cost her more than her voice revealed. As part of an arrangement. He needs order in his household. Someone to manage the accounts, to oversee the staff, to be present." "And the arrangement?" Eleanor pressed. "What do you get from it, Father?" Arthur put his hat back on. He stood. He walked to the kitchen door and stopped in the doorway. "The man has means. There are debts to settle. I am not asking you to understand. I am asking you to obey." He left. The sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor. Eleanor stared at the half-peeled potato in her hand, the knife, the basin of cloudy water, the window with the broken hinge. That let in the wind. She didn't cry. Not then. It was later in the sewing room, with her face buried in the pillow so no one would hear her, that she allowed everything she had been carrying inside to come out. But even then it was a short, controlled cry, as though she was weeping with just enough permission and no more. The next day she rose before dawn, folded the blanket, washed her face with cold water, and began to pack her clothes for the journey. She spent 3 days in that state of silent preparation that is, in truth, a form of mourning. She folded garments she hadn't needed in years. She found things tucked away in the bottom of the trunk that reminded her of her mother, a handkerchief with embroidered initials, a small devotional card with the gilded edge already faded, a lock of dark hair wrapped in paper. She stored it all carefully. There was not much she was taking, but it was everything she had. Catherine arrived on the second day, informed by their father's letter. She came with her husband and her 2 children and spent the afternoon in the sitting room talking about inconsequential things while the children ran through the garden. Before leaving, she went to find Eleanor in her room. "Father says he is a good man," said Catherine, standing in the doorway, with that way she had of delivering important information as though it were an afterthought. "Do you know him?" asked Eleanor. "No, but he has a good reputation. And land." Eleanor kept folding. Clothes. How fortunate, she said without looking up. Catherine paused. Perhaps she expected something more, some emotion she could manage, but Eleanor gave her nothing, and Catherine, who had never really known how to be with her sister, left with the same ease with which she had arrived. The day of departure dawned cloudy, which seemed appropriate. Arthur had hired a hand to carry the trunk to the carriage. Eleanor came downstairs with her travel bag, dressed in dark colours, her hair pinned, more carefully than usual. Her father waited by the door. He gave her an envelope. "For the first few days," he said. Eleanor took it without opening it. "May I write to you?" she asked. "If you wish." There was no embrace, no words of comfort or apology. Arthur briefly placed a hand on her shoulder, like someone giving a pat to an animal before letting it go, and then stepped aside to let her pass. Eleanor descended the front steps, climbed into the carriage, and sat straight, her bag on her lap, her gaze forward. She didn't look back, not because it didn't hurt, but because she knew that if she looked back, something in her would break, and she needed to arrive whole wherever she was being taken. The journey to Ashford Manor took just over 2 hours by carriage. It left the village by the southern road, crossed a stone bridge over a stream, climbed between fields of wheat and through apple orchards until reaching an area of ancient oaks where the landscape became at once more severe and more beautiful. Eleanor watched the countryside. She didn't think, or tried not to think. She observed. A hawk in the still air, the oaks with their dense shadow, a shepherd with his flock on the hillside, the sky beginning to open as they moved forward. When she first saw the walls of the manor, she felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly fear. It was more the vertigo of the unknown, that moment before taking a step, in which the body knows it must move but doesn't, yet know in which direction. The walls were of pale stone, tall, covered in places with old ivy. The gate was dark wood with iron fittings. The carriage stopped before it, and the driver knocked. A few minutes passed. Then the gate opened from within, and there appeared a woman of about 50, robust, wearing an apron, with grey hair pulled into a tight bun, and an expression that was neither hostile nor warm. It was the expression of someone who is taking measure. "Miss Whitmore?" she asked. "Yes," said Eleanor, stepping down from the carriage without waiting for assistance. The woman looked her up and down, not with contempt, but with that practical thoroughness of one who needs to know what she's working with. "I am Margaret, the housekeeper. Please follow me." The trunk was unloaded. The carriage departed, and Margaret led Eleanor through the gate into the interior of the estate. The first thing she saw was the courtyard, large, paved with stone, with a fountain at its centre. That was not running. Orange trees in the corners, their fruit still green, pots of geraniums on the window ledges, some neglected, a climbing vine covering part of the arcade. Everything had the appearance of something that had been beautiful, and still was, but that had gone a long time without the attention it needed. "Mr. Ashford is not at the estate at present," said Margaret as they walked. "He will arrive before nightfall. In the meantime, I will show you to your rooms and explain how the household operates." "Very well," said Eleanor. The room assigned to her was in the east wing of the main house. It was spacious, with high ceilings, a window overlooking the kitchen garden, and a wooden bed with a wool mattress. There was a wardrobe, a bedside table, a basin and white porcelain jug. On the wall a small wooden cross. On the floor a woven rug. It was larger than the sewing room. Eleanor set her bag on the bed and looked at the window. The garden stretched out, orderly and green, with rows of tomatoes, beans, cucumbers. There was an old fig tree at the far end, gnarled and bent, with a dense, dark canopy. "May I walk in the gardens?" she asked. Margaret, still in the doorway, seemed to weigh the question. "Of course," she said. "The estate is large. There is time to get to know it." She left. And Eleanor was alone for the first time in this new place, in this new life she had not chosen, but which somehow she would have to learn to inhabit. She washed her hands, straightened her hair and went out to the courtyard. She walked slowly. She observed the stables at the far end, where she could hear the movement of horses. She saw a young stable hand sweeping the cobblestones with slow, distracted movements. She saw an older woman hanging laundry on a rope strung between two trees. Everyone looked at her. No one spoke to her. It was the look of people who know that someone new has arrived but don't yet know what place they occupy. Eleanor understood. She had seen it before in the village when someone came from outside. The community closes first, like a fist, and then slowly opens. She had patience. It was one of the few things the years in her father's house had given her without meaning to. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen garden, learning the layout of the plantings, noticing what needed attention, which plants were neglected. She found pleasure in that, in the simple act of looking and understanding. It was something she knew how to do, see what was missing and think about how to remedy it. The sun was beginning to go down when she heard the sound of hooves on the drive. She returned to the courtyard slowly, without hurrying. Margaret was already there, hands clasped before her apron. The young stable hand had dropped his broom and was standing straight. The gate opened. 2 horses entered. The first was a dark animal, large, that knew the way well, and entered with the confidence of one returning home. On it came a man. Eleanor saw him, and something in her chest grew quiet in a strange way, like when you brace for a blow, and the blow doesn't come. Richard Ashford was exactly what his reputation described: tall, strongly built, with the presence of men who have commanded for years and no longer need to raise their voices to be obeyed. He wore a dark riding coat, dusty from the road. His hair was brown and short, with a few grey threads at the temples. His beard was well kept. His green eyes, which from a distance seemed almost grey. He dismounted without assistance. He handed the reins to the stable hand. He removed his riding gloves while walking toward the centre of the courtyard, and then he saw her. It was not a long look. It lasted only an instant. But Eleanor, who had spent years learning to read people's faces the way one reads the weather in the sky, caught something in that look she hadn't expected. It wasn't the evaluation of someone sizing up an acquisition, nor was it the interest of someone who sees something they like. It was something closer to the surprise of someone who sees something they didn't expect to see. Richard Ashford looked at Eleanor Whitmore for a second. Then he turned away, approached Margaret and spoke in a low voice. Margaret nodded. "Miss Whitmore," said Margaret then in a louder voice with her formal announcing tone, "Mr. Ashford." Eleanor gave a slight inclination of her head. Richard looked at her again. He nodded, briefly. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low, unadorned. "Welcome to Ashford Manor. I hope the journey was not too long." "The road is beautiful," Eleanor replied. "It didn't feel heavy." Another nod. And then he turned toward the house, and Margaret followed, and the conversation, if indeed it had been a conversation, was over. Eleanor remained in the courtyard. The young stable hand glanced at her sidelong. The woman at the laundry rope kept working as though nothing had happened. The fig tree in the garden cast its long shadow across the cobblestones. It had not been what Eleanor expected. She hadn't quite known what she had expected. A possessive look? Some exercise of authority over her? There had been none of that. Only a tired man returning home, greeting someone who had arrived for the first time, with just the right courtesy and reasonable distance. It was little, but it was different from what she had feared. That evening dinner was served in the main dining room. The table was long, of dark wood, with iron candelabras. Richard sat at one end. Eleanor was led by Margaret to the opposite end, which struck her at once as a relief and a form of communication. They were not equals. They did not share the same position in this house, and the distance of the table said so without needing words. They ate almost in silence. There was a vegetable soup, bread, cheese, some lamb. Everything simple and good. Richard ate quickly and with concentration, like someone who has things in his head he can't quite let go of. Eleanor ate carefully, watching without appearing to watch. Halfway through the meal he spoke. "Have you had a chance to see the estate?" "Only the courtyard and the garden," replied Eleanor. "This afternoon. Tomorrow Margaret will show you the rest. There is a good deal to learn." A pause. "There are also accounts that have been without order for some time," he added, without looking up from his plate. "I would be grateful." Eleanor nodded. "I can begin whenever you like." Richard looked at her then, briefly. It was not a look of approval or disapproval. It was the look of someone recording information. "After breakfast," he said. "I'll leave the ledgers in the study." And he returned to his plate. Dinner ended. Richard stood, gave a slight bow by way of good night, and left the dining room. Eleanor remained seated a moment longer, her glass of water in hand, looking at the candelabras. She had not been humiliated. She had not been treated like a servant or a possession. She had been treated, essentially, like a person who had come to do a job. It was so little and, at the same time, so unexpectedly sufficient that Eleanor didn't quite know what to do with it. That night, in the wooden bed with the wool mattress, listening to the sound of crickets in the garden, she was slow to fall asleep. Not from fear, but because she was thinking, and thinking at night, when the mind is quiet and honest, is sometimes more exhausting than the work of the day. What was she in this house? Not an employee, not a wife, not exactly a guest. She was something without a name, something that was there by an arrangement that no one had fully explained, and which would have to find its own place in the space between definitions. She was afraid of that nameless place, but also, in some very small corner of herself, she felt something close to curiosity. She fell asleep, looking at the window. The moon was full over the garden. The first days at Ashford Manor were days of silent learning. Eleanor came to the study after breakfast, as she had been told, and found on the table a pile of account ledgers, unfiled invoices, letters from suppliers and tenancy agreements that had been waiting for attention for months. It was a disorder that spoke of a man who knew how to manage the land, but had let the paperwork accumulate the way one lets weeds grow while attending to what is urgent. Eleanor set to work with the quiet methodology that had always been with her. First, she organized. Then she understood. Then she began to bring order. Richard appeared mid-morning, stopped in the doorway of the study, looked at the state of the ledgers on the table and the way Eleanor had arranged them in columns and groups, and said only, "Good," and he left. He was a man of few words. Eleanor discovered this in those first days with the same patience with which one discovers a territory, walking slowly, paying attention without rushing. He wasn't exactly cold. He was contained. There was a difference. The cold feels nothing. The contained feels but chooses not to show it. Eleanor, who had spent years learning to read her father, recognized the difference. Richard Ashford was a man who had locked a door from the inside and lost the key, not because the key didn't exist, but because he had decided at some point that it was safer that way. She understood it better one afternoon in the second week, when she passed the room that was always closed at the end of the east corridor. Margaret, walking beside her, saw her look at the door and said, without Eleanor having asked, "That was the mistress's room. It has not been opened since she passed." Eleanor didn't respond, but she understood. There was a grief in this house that no one had fully buried. It was in the closed room, in the fountain that didn't run, in the neglected geraniums, in the dust-covered ledgers. It was the grief of a man who hadn't known how to move forward because moving forward seemed like a betrayal. Eleanor understood that. She too knew the weight of incomplete griefs. The relationship between them began to take shape in those early days in a gradual and almost imperceptible way. There were no great conversations. There were moments. The exchange of words in the study when he came to check on the progress of the accounts, the greeting at dinner, a question from him about the suppliers or the tenants, an observation from her about a discrepancy in a figure or a debt that needed addressing. It was a working relationship, but it was also the only real relationship Eleanor had in that place, and the only one Richard seemed willing to maintain. The estate's staff opened slowly. Margaret was the first to show something that could be called, if not affection, at least respect. Eleanor had seen her on the third day disagreeing with the hand in charge of the hen house over the amount of feed being used, and had offered a calculation that resolved the matter, without either of them losing face. Margaret had looked at her then with the expression of someone who is revising an opinion, and from that moment on treated her with a slightly warmer consideration. Then there was Thomas, the young stable hand who swept the courtyard. He was about 17, quiet like his master, but with a different shyness, more childlike, and sometimes Eleanor would find him watching her with a mixture of curiosity and something that might be shy admiration. One day, without anyone asking him to, he left a small bunch of wild thyme on the windowsill of the study. He said nothing. He simply left it there and disappeared. Eleanor put it in a glass of water on the desk. And then there was Dorothy, the cook, a small and energetic woman who had been at the manor for 20 years and knew everything about everyone without ever saying so, who was the slowest to open but also the most sincere when she did. One morning in the third week, while Eleanor passed through the kitchen to fetch water, Dorothy asked her, without looking up, whether she knew how to make the almond pudding from her grandmother's recipe. Eleanor said yes. Dorothy gestured for her to come closer, and they spent the morning in the kitchen, side by side, hands in the mixture, speaking little and understanding much. Those were the days, small, concrete, with the flavor of work well done and the slowness of things that grow without haste. But there was something that remained unresolved. The arrangement. The arrangement her father had made with Richard Ashford, and that no one had fully explained to her. Eleanor knew it was something financial, that there was money involved, that her presence at the manor was not simply that of an administrator. But Richard had not mentioned any of it. He had made no demands, hinted at no expectation that went beyond the work. And that unsettled her, not because she wanted him to, but because uncertainty has its own weight. One afternoon in the fourth week, Eleanor was in the study when Richard entered with an expression different from his usual one. It wasn't the expression of work, it was the expression of someone who has decided to say something they have long left unsaid. He sat in the chair across from the desk. Eleanor closed the ledger. There was a silence that neither of them hurried to fill. "I want to explain something," said Richard at last. Eleanor waited. "The arrangement with your father," he began, with that economy of words that was his way of speaking. "It was not what you probably believe." "Then tell me what it was," said Eleanor calmly. Richard looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "Your father owes me money, not a great deal, but it is his to owe. When he wrote to me proposing this arrangement, I could have refused. I didn't." A pause. "I didn't refuse because your situation in that house struck me as unjust, and because this estate needs an order, I cannot give it alone. It was a practical decision, not—" He searched for the word. "It was not what your father implied it was." Eleanor held his gaze. "And what did he imply it was?" she asked, though she knew the answer. that you would come here as a future wife." The silence that followed was of a different nature, heavier. "And you don't want that," said Eleanor, and it was not a question. "It is not a decision that belongs to your father," said Richard, "nor to me. It is a decision that belongs to you." Eleanor blinked. It was the last answer she had expected. "What I want to tell you," he continued, and there was something in his voice that cost him like someone moving heavy things, "is that you may stay here with the dignity of someone who works and has a place, without conditions of any other kind. If at any point you wish to leave, I will arrange it." Eleanor looked at her own hands on the closed ledger. The hands that had peeled potatoes, mended clothes, added up columns of figures. The hands of a small life. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you have been here 4 weeks, and not one day have you seemed as though you were well," he said, with a plainness that hurt her in a way she didn't expect. Eleanor raised her eyes. "I am well," she said. "No," he said without harshness, "you are not, and you have the right not to be." It was the first time in many years that anyone had said that to her, that she had the right not to be well. Eleanor didn't cry, but something in her shifted. The way a stone that has been in the same place for a long time gives way slightly, just slightly, and lets water through. "Thank you," she said, with a smaller voice than usual. Richard nodded. He stood. He went to the door and stopped. "If you decide to stay," he said without turning, "let it be because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go." And he left. Eleanor remained sitting in the study until the light from the window changed color and the sun began to go down over the garden. Thank you so much for joining us this far. If you are still with us, comment the word heart so we know you have reached this point in the story. There was something Richard Ashford never spoke of, and yet that was present in everything he did. The story of his marriage to Evelyn. Evelyn Ashford, née Hargreaves, had been the woman he married at 27 in a wedding held in the village, with all the ceremony appropriate to 2 families of respectable standing. It had not been a marriage of convenience in the cold sense of the word. Richard had loved her in his way, with that way of loving of men who have learned that love is something demonstrated through actions, not words. Evelyn was intelligent, warm, with a capacity for human connection that he lacked. It had been she who had set the fountain in the courtyard running, who had planted the geraniums, who had filled the house with that energy that now existed only as absence. They had had 4 years together. They had had no children, though they had tried. And then, in the winter of the 5th year of their marriage, Evelyn had fallen ill with a fever that the local physician could not treat in time. Richard had been out on the estate the day she worsened. When he returned, she could no longer speak. She died that same night, her hand in his. That was what Richard Ashford carried with him. Not only the grief, but the guilt of one who hadn't arrived in time. The guilt of the one who was out on the land, when he should have been home. The absurd and irrational guilt that heeds no reason, but installs itself regardless and stays. And so, the closed room. And so the dry fountain. And so the dust-covered ledgers. When grief has no form, it becomes neglect. It becomes the abandonment of small things. It becomes that way of living on the surface of one's own life, without sinking into anything, without allowing oneself to be touched by anything. Eleanor discovered all of this not because anyone told her in one go, but because she lived in that house, and houses speak if one knows how to listen. The closed room spoke. The way Richard sometimes stared at the empty chair at the far end of the table during dinner spoke. The fact that the only portrait in the study was of his parents, not of Evelyn, because Evelyn's was put away somewhere no one named, spoke. It was Dorothy who told her the details, one rainy afternoon in the kitchen, while the storm shook the shutters and they were shelling. Almonds for the Christmas pudding Dorothy began preparing months in advance. "She was a good woman," said Dorothy, with that tone of someone remembering a person whose absence can no longer do any harm. "She wasn't easy. She had a temper. But she was fair, and she loved him in a way you could see." Eleanor shelled almonds in silence. "And did he love her?" she asked. Dorothy glanced at her sidelong. "In his way. He's not a man for saying things. But when she fell ill, that man didn't sleep for 3 days. He sat in the chair beside the bed and didn't move. When she died, he walked out of the room, closed the door, and hasn't opened it since." "Has no one gone in since then?" "I go in to clean once a month. He never does." A long pause. "The people in the village say he should marry again," Dorothy continued, chopping almonds with more energy than necessary. "That enough time has passed, that the estate needs a mistress." She snorted, as if the heart had a clock. Eleanor thought about that for a long time afterwards, back in her room, with the rain beating against the window. The heart without a clock, the way the time of pain never coincides with the time of the calendar. She understood it too well. And it was in that moment, in that room with the rain and the sound of the oaks bending in the wind, that Eleanor allowed herself for the first time to ask a question she had until then avoided. What did she want exactly from this place? Not what she needed, not what she had been given, what she wanted. The answer didn't come at once. It came in fragments over the following days, the way clarity arrives when one stops searching for it too hard. She wanted the garden, the feeling of her hands in the soil, of understanding the cycle of things that grow. She wanted the study with its smell of old paper and ink, the satisfaction of numbers that balanced. She wanted the mornings in the kitchen with Dorothy, the almond pudding, the freshly baked bread. She wanted Thomas and his shyness, and the sprigs of wild thyme on the windowsill. She wanted the way Margaret looked at her now, with that consideration that was the most honest of all because it hadn't come easily. And she wanted, though she still didn't say it to herself in so many words, the conversations in the study, the few brief, concrete ones, the way Richard Ashford listened when she spoke, with an attention she hadn't expected from a man who had everything. The way he sometimes paused before, responding as though what she had said deserved that second of consideration. It was not love, not yet anything that could be called that, but it was the first time in a long while that Eleanor felt that her presence somewhere mattered, not because she was useful, though she was, but because someone saw her. That distinction was larger than it appeared. October arrived with the first chills and the smell of damp earth that fills the fields after autumn rains. The orchard came into harvest. The oaks shed their acorns. The kitchen garden entered the winter crop phase, cabbages, leeks, root vegetables. Eleanor had begun, with Margaret's permission, to reorganize the manor's storeroom. It was a task no one had asked of her, but which was necessary, and that was sufficient reason to do it. She spent several days sorting tools, medicines for the livestock, seeds, preserves. She found things no one remembered having stored, things that had sat in the same place for years without anyone knowing what they were for. Richard found out because Margaret mentioned it, and one morning he appeared in the storeroom while Eleanor was up a wooden ladder examining the highest shelf. "Be careful," he said from the doorway. Eleanor didn't come down from the ladder. She finished checking the shelf and then descended. "There are seeds from 5 years ago that are no longer any use," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "And there is a box of medicines that have expired. All of it should be discarded." "Very well," he said. "I also found something you may want to see." She led him to the back of the storeroom. On a low shelf, behind some boxes of preserved goods, was a small wooden box with the name of the estate engraved on the lid. Eleanor had opened it and inside had found papers. Old contracts, maps of the land with boundaries marked by hand, a list of tenants with their names and terms. Richard looked at it. He picked up the box with a slowness that said he recognized what it was. "These are my father's," he said. "I thought they would be important to keep." "Yes," he said, with a voice that carried a different weight than usual. He stood looking at the box for a moment. Then he closed it and tucked it under his arm. "Thank you," he said. It was a single word, but it was not the thank you of courtesy. It was the thank you of someone who has had something returned to them. Eleanor watched him leave the storeroom with the box under his arm and thought that sometimes people need someone else to see the value of what they themselves can no longer see. The harvest season arrived in early November, and with it the most intense rhythm of the year at the estate. Seasonal labourers came from nearby villages, men and women of all ages, and Ashford Manor filled with voices, noise, life. It was a remarkable transformation. That house, which had so often felt quiet and contained, opened up suddenly like a fist unfolding. Eleanor worked alongside everyone. Richard noticed but said nothing. She was the one who coordinated the shifts in the processing barn, who kept the daily work records, who made sure the hot meals reached the fields at the agreed time. It was physical, organizational, constant work. And she did it with that quiet efficiency that was her way of being in the world. One day, toward the end of the second week of harvest, when fatigue was showing in everyone, one of the older workers, a man named Fletcher, who had come from a village to the north, got into a dispute with the foreman. It was not a violent dispute, but it was heated and threatened to become something that would bring work to a halt. Eleanor arrived before Richard. She listened to both men without interrupting. Then she spoke quietly, with precise words, identifying the real problem beneath the conflict, a miscalculation in the day's wages that had shortchanged the labourer without the foreman noticing. She corrected it on the spot, figures in hand, and the matter was settled before Richard reached the field. When he arrived and Margaret explained what had happened, Richard searched for Eleanor with his eyes among the workers. She was at the far end, talking to one of the women workers, her hair loose in the wind, and her hands stained from the work. Something in him, in that moment, without his being able to explain it clearly afterwards, settled, like something that had long been moving without an anchor finally finding where to be still. That evening, at dinner, Richard poured 2 glasses of wine. It was the first time he had done so. He offered one to Eleanor without saying anything. She took it. They drank in a silence that was no longer the silence of the beginning, the silence of 2 strangers, but something different. It was the silence of 2 people who no longer need to fill everything. "You handled things well today," he said at last. "It wasn't difficult," said Eleanor. "One simply needed to listen to them both. Most people would have started by talking. Talking first tends to complicate what listening would resolve." Richard looked at her. She held his gaze without effort, without withdrawing it, without the gesture of deference that other people had when he looked at them like that. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Eleanor thought for a moment. "In my father's house," she said. "I learned that in places where there is little room to speak, one must listen carefully." Richard didn't respond at once. When he did, it was with a question she hadn't expected. "Do you miss it? Your home?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I miss my mother," she said. "She has been gone for years, and I miss some moments. Sunday afternoons with Lydia, the schoolteacher, the Thursday market." She paused. "But the house itself, it is not the same as a home." "And this," he said, with a vague gesture that encompassed the table, the estate, the space between them. "I am still getting to know it," she answered. A small smile crossed Richard's face. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Eleanor saw it. It was the first she had seen from him, and it was, she thought, a smile that had been stored away for a very long time. "That is an honest answer," he said. "It's the only one I have," she said. The weeks that followed had a different quality. Nothing had changed in any visible way. Richard was still the same reserved man of few words. Eleanor was still the same woman of quiet work and discreet presence. The estate continued with its rhythm of tasks, seasons, daily demands, but there was something in the air between them that had become easier to breathe. They coincided more. They walked together through the fields some afternoons when he wanted to check on the orchards and she needed to note the state of the harvest. They talked more on those walks than in the first months together. He would explain things about the land, the water, the cycles of the countryside. She would ask questions that others never asked because others took everything for granted. And he discovered in answering that there were things in his own knowledge he had never articulated aloud, and that in articulating them they took on a different weight. One afternoon, walking along the northern boundary of the old orchard, Richard pointed to a group of older trees with twisted trunks and low canopies. "These are over 200 years old," he said. "My great-grandfather planted them." Eleanor looked at them. She touched the bark of one. "And they still bear fruit?" "Less than the younger ones, but the taste is different, richer, another depth." "Would you keep them, even if they yielded nothing?" The question surprised him. "Yes," he said after a moment. "They are part of this." Eleanor nodded, looking at the old trees. "That is what I like most about places with history," she said, "that they hold on to what was, even when it is no longer useful." Richard looked at her in profile. The afternoon light fell on her dark hair, on the soft line of her cheek. "What do you hold from history?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, barely. "Little that is worth telling," she said, "but I hold it." He didn't press. But they walked longer than necessary among the old trees, in that October light that makes everything seem at once more serious and more beautiful. It was in December that the letter arrived. Eleanor recognized it by the seal. It was from her father. She opened it in the study, alone, and read with, "That calm one learns when one no longer expects good news from certain people. Arthur wrote to inform her that Catherine was expecting her third child, and that the family awaited her for Christmas, that her presence would be appropriate, that there were family matters to be discussed, and that Mr. Ashford ought to understand that the bonds of blood took precedence over any employment arrangement. It was a letter of ownership. Though it didn't say so in those exact words, it said so with every word it chose." Eleanor set it on the table. She looked at it a moment. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope and placed it in the drawer. That evening Richard came late to dinner. He had come from a meeting with the southern tenants, tired and with dust on his jacket. Eleanor served his plate without being asked. He sat across from her as usual. "Is everything all right?" he asked, because he noticed something different in her, that extra restraint she had when something weighed on her. "I received a letter from my father." Richard didn't ask for the contents. He waited. "He asks me to come for Christmas," said Eleanor, "to Catherine's house. Do you want to go?" The question was direct and without guile. Not, "Can you go?" Not, "You may do as you please." It was, "Do you want to?" Eleanor thought. "Not particularly," she said. "But there are things I should close, conversations I haven't had." "With your father?" "Yes." A silence. "If you need to go, go," said Richard. The Estate can do without you for a few days." "I know," said Eleanor, with a gentleness that was not submission, "but there is something I want to say to you before I decide." Richard looked at her. "When I arrived here," said Eleanor, with that calm that cost her but which she held, "I didn't know what this place was or what I was in it. I didn't know whether I would be treated as a burden or as a person." She paused. "And you treated me as a person, from the first day, without my asking." Richard didn't respond, but his expression shifted in a subtle way, like a tense surface that eases slightly. "What my father did was not right," she continued, "and what you did, giving me the choice to stay or leave, was the most decent thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. I wanted you to know that." A long silence. The candle between them flickered. "And will you go?" he said at last. "I am going to write to him," said Eleanor, "to my father, and I will say what I need to say. If afterwards I still want to go, I will go." Richard nodded. "Good," he said. "Eat." But something in the tone of that word, simple and direct, held a warmth that longer words rarely carry. Eleanor wrote the letter to her father that same night. It was not a long letter, not an angry one. It was the letter of a woman who had learned that silence can also be a form of harm, and that it was time to say things plainly. She wrote that she understood the difficulties of the family, that she bore no grudge for the decisions that had been made, though some had wounded her, that she had found at the manor a place where her work was valued and her presence respected, that if there were family matters to discuss, they could do so by post, because she did not intend to return to London unless it was of her own free will and on her own terms. She signed with her full name. She sealed the envelope and left it ready for the morning post. Then she sat at the study desk with the lamp burning, looking at the flame, feeling something that took her a moment to identify. It was lightness, the lightness of having said what needed to be said, of having claimed, with quiet words, the space no one had given her, but no one could take from her, the space of being herself. Christmas came without Eleanor going to London. Arthur replied to her letter with a brief, cold note that essentially acknowledged receipt, without conceding any ground to what she had said. It was the reply of a man who had not expected his daughter to have opinions and didn't know what to do with them. Eleanor read it, stored it away, and didn't think of it again. Christmas at the manor was a surprise. Eleanor hadn't expected it, but Dorothy had a way of transforming the kitchen at special times of year that turned the whole house into a different place. She appeared one morning with a haul of spices, dried fruits, sugar and flour, and for 3 days the kitchen was a kingdom of smells and warmth to which Eleanor was invited to contribute without anyone having to ask her to stay. They made mince pies, shortbread, a Christmas pudding. Margaret oversaw the decoration of the dining room with pine branches and bundles of cinnamon sticks. Thomas arranged a nativity scene in the main hall with figures that had been on the estate for decades and had that beloved quality of things taken out once a year. Richard watched all of this with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read at first. It wasn't indifference, nor was it simple cheerfulness. It was something closer to the surprise of someone who had spent a long time expecting things to be one way, and found themselves unexpectedly facing the possibility that they could be another. On Christmas Eve, the manor filled with the permanent staff who stayed on the estate. Thomas, the blacksmith, the foreman and his family, Dorothy, who had lived there for 20 years. Richard presided over dinner in the large dining room, and Eleanor was to his right, not at the other end of the table. No one had formally arranged it that way. It happened naturally, the way things that have long been true tend to happen, even before anyone has said them. After dinner, when the others had retired, and only the two of them remained in the dining room, Richard poured 2 glasses of sweet wine. He offered one to Eleanor. She took it. They sat before the fireplace in the leather armchairs that normally faced the study doorway, and which someone, probably Margaret, had moved to the dining room for the occasion. The fire crackled. The night was cold and silent outside. "It has been a good evening," said Eleanor. "Yes," said Richard. A pause. "This house hasn't had this in years," he said, looking at the fire. "Had what?" He took his time answering. "People, noise, warmth of a different kind." Eleanor looked at the fire as well. "Did you miss it?" "I didn't know," he said, "until tonight." It was the closest thing to a confession that Richard Ashford had made in a very long time. He didn't say it with drama. He said it the way one states the time, plainly as a fact. Eleanor didn't respond at once. When she did, it was without turning to him, still looking at the fire. "The things we miss are sometimes the ones we have most carefully kept," she said. The silence that followed was long and not uncomfortable. Richard turned slightly toward her. Eleanor felt his gaze. Not the evaluating look of the beginning, not the look of a man measuring what he has. It was something else. It was the look of someone seeing something clearly for the first time. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without a formal address. She turned. "There are things I don't know how to say well," he said, with that direct honesty that was the best and most difficult thing about him. "I never have. Evelyn knew when I was being too silent." He paused. The fire crackled. "But I know that since you came to this house, something has changed that I can't quite name, and it seems right to me that you are here. It was little as a declaration of love if measured in words, but it was much as a declaration from Richard Ashford, who was a man for whom every word had a cost, and he didn't spend them in vain." Eleanor looked at him, and in her gaze there was something that had been building for months. Not the sudden love of stories, but the slow love of things that grow in difficult ground and for that reason have deeper roots. "So do I," she said simply, and that was enough. For that evening it was more than enough. Winter passed with that particular slowness of winters in the countryside, which are long but not empty. There was always something to do, repairing what autumn had broken, preparing the ground for spring, tending the livestock on the coldest days. The relationship between Eleanor and Richard kept growing in its own way, without haste, without exaggerated gestures. There were more conversations, more walks through the fields, more moments in the study that lasted longer than the work required. There were also silences that were now different from all the silences before. Shared silences, comfortable, without the need to fill them. But there was one thing that remained unresolved, one thing that still hung in the air between them like dust floating in a closed room. The bedroom at the end of the east corridor. Eleanor never mentioned it. Richard didn't either, but it was a presence that they both felt, because they both knew what it meant. It was the grief that still hadn't found its form. It was the door he had spent years not opening, because opening it meant admitting that Evelyn was truly gone, and that admitting it was not a betrayal, but a necessity. It was in February, on a day of dry cold with the clean blue sky that winters in the English countryside sometimes have, that something changed. Eleanor was making her way down the east corridor with some papers for Richard when she saw him. He was standing before the closed door. He wasn't doing anything. He was simply standing there, one hand resting on the wood of the door, looking at it. Eleanor stopped. She said nothing. She simply stayed a few steps away, papers in hand, waiting. Richard didn't turn, but he knew she was there. He knew by the way his shoulder relaxed slightly, as though the presence of someone familiar and trusted was enough to release something that had been held tight. They remained like that for several minutes. The silence of the corridor, the afternoon light coming through the window at the far end, the wooden door beneath his hand, and then, slowly, Richard lowered his hand. He turned. He looked at Eleanor. "Help me," he said. It was a word that didn't come easily to that man. Eleanor nodded. She stepped forward, and together they entered. Evelyn's room smelled of old wood and dried lavender. There was a dressing room, a bed with an embroidered coverlet, a dressing table with a mirror. Everything was clean because Dorothy came in to clean, but everything had that stillness of something that has been waiting too long. Richard remained in the doorway for a moment. Then he went in. He walked to the window and opened it. The cold February air entered with the smell of earth and grass. Eleanor let him be. She stayed by the door in silence, without moving, without speaking. It wasn't necessary to speak. Richard stood looking out the window for a long time. Then he turned and looked at the room, with an expression that was difficult to describe. It was not the sharp pain of the beginning. It was something closer to farewell, to the recognition that what was, and that what one loves does not disappear because one continues living. "She was happy here," he said very quietly. "You can tell," said Eleanor, "from the way everything is placed." Richard went to the dressing table. He opened a drawer and took out the portrait that no one named. He looked at it. He held it in his hands. "She was a good woman," he said. "I know," said Eleanor. "Dorothy told me." A pause. "Does it trouble you?" he asked, not quite certain what exactly he was asking. "No," said Eleanor honestly. "That you loved her doesn't trouble me. It seems to speak well of you." Richard looked at her. There was something in his expression that was relief, and something more. Something that was searching for words and not yet finding them. "I don't know if I can," he began. "You don't have to know anything. Today," said Eleanor. "You don't have to resolve anything right now." He nodded slowly. Before they left, he placed the portrait on the dressing table, visible. Not stored away, not hidden. And he closed the window, but he did not lock the door. Spring arrived with its usual force, suddenly, with blossoms on the apple trees and warmth on midday shoulders. The land came alive again with that generosity the earth has when you allow it. Eleanor had written to Lydia, the schoolteacher, telling her something of what her life had been in recent months. Not everything, but enough for Lydia, who knew her well, to read between the lines and reply with that kind perceptiveness that was characteristic of her. "It seems you have found something you didn't know you were looking for. That is usually the best thing that can be found." Eleanor kept the letter in the study drawer, beside the old papers from Richard's great-grandfather. One Sunday in April, Richard asked her to accompany him to check on the North Fields, the ones furthest from the manor that he visited on horseback a few times a year. Eleanor had never ridden through that part of the estate. She accepted. They set out early, while there was still a chill in the air. Richard on his dark horse, Eleanor on a grey mare the foreman had chosen for her on account of its calm temperament. They rode in silence for a while, letting the horses set the pace, while the sun rose and the light changed over the fields. At some point along the way, between the fields of wheat that were beginning to green, Richard talked about things he had not talked about before. Things from childhood on that land, from the father who had taught him to read the countryside like a book, from the summers of his adolescence working alongside the labourers to learn what the land demands. He spoke with a naturalness different from that of the study or dinner. It was the naturalness of people when they are in the place where they feel most themselves. Eleanor listened. She asked questions. She laughed at some points, and he watched her when she laughed, with that attention he no longer tried to conceal. They stopped at midday by a stream where the horses drank. They ate what Dorothy had prepared: bread, cheese, olives, some cured meat. Sitting on the bank of the stream, with the horses grazing a few meters away, the sun high and a gentle wind in the trees. "What would have become of you if everything had been different?" asked Richard, suddenly, without its coming from any particular thread of conversation. Eleanor thought about it. "I don't know," she said. "Perhaps a teacher. I like books. Or perhaps I would have found some way of keeping accounts for someone." She smiled. "Numbers have always come naturally to me." "You are good at more than that," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "You have a way of being with people," he continued, "that makes them feel seen, without doing anything particular to achieve it. Simply being there." It was the most precise compliment anyone had ever paid her, not about her appearance, not about her usefulness, about her way of being. Eleanor didn't respond at once. She looked at the water of the stream, running clear over the stones. "I learned to listen because no one listened to me," she said at last. "It was not a virtue, it was a necessity." "Sometimes virtues are," he said. The wind moved through the trees. The horses lifted their heads for a moment and then went back to grazing. "Richard," she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his name alone, without any formal address, and he noticed. "Yes." "What do you want from all of this?" she asked, with that direct honesty that was her way of facing the things that mattered. "Not from the estate, from this." There was a silence long enough to be an answer in itself. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "As your administrator?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not as your administrator any longer." Eleanor held his gaze. "Then, as what?" "As whoever you want to be," he said. "With whatever place you decide to have, without anyone's father's arrangements. Without conditions." It was everything that needed to be said, and everything that needed to be heard. Eleanor stood, went to where her mare stood, stroked her neck. The animal snorted softly. The sun beat down on the green wheat fields. "Let's go back," she said. Richard stood. "Is that a yes?" he asked, with something that in another man would have been nervousness, and in him was simply attention. Eleanor mounted her mare. She looked at him from above. "It's I'll think about it," she said, "which in me amounts to almost a yes." And she turned the mare back down the road, letting the wind hit her face and her hair, with that new and still fragile feeling of being someone who has somewhere to return to. What came next was a storm. Not metaphorical. A real storm, the kind that arrives suddenly in an English spring, with clouds that gather in hours and then break with violence over the land. The sky had been overcast for 3 days when the storm came at night, with strong wind and heavy rain. Eleanor woke to the sound of the shutters banging and got up to close them. From her window over the garden she saw something she should not see. One of the lamps in the storeroom was still lit, and the wind had brought down part of the temporary roof that covered the hay store. She went to find Richard before going to the storeroom. She knocked on his door. "Richard, the storeroom, the hay." He was out in seconds, already partly dressed, with the quickness of someone trained for emergencies. He was the first to reach the storeroom. The rain fell hard, the wind moved the wet hay. They worked together with Thomas and the foreman for over an hour, securing the makeshift roof, moving the hay inside, protecting the tools. It was physical, urgent work, with no time to think. Eleanor carried, pushed, held what she was asked to hold. Richard worked beside her, shoulder to shoulder, without treating her any differently from the others. When they finished, soaked and exhausted, they took shelter in the entrance arcade with the rain still hammering the roof. Thomas and the foreman went to dry off. Richard and Eleanor remained alone in the doorway, watching the storm. Eleanor's hair was drenched. Richard had mud on his hands and on his shirt. They were both still breathing with the rhythm of the recent effort. And it was in that moment, in that doorway, with the rain and the mud and the exhaustion, that Richard turned to her and said what he had long been unable to say. "I am in love with you." He didn't say it with solemnity. He said it with the plainness of a man who has been slow to accept a truth, and having accepted it, sees no reason to dress it up. Eleanor looked at him. She was drenched, tired, her hair stuck to her face, and she smiled. "I know," she said. Richard blinked. "You knew." "For weeks," she said, "but I needed you to say it." He exhaled with a mixture of exasperation and something that was unmistakably happiness. "I could have said it sooner," he said. "And so could I," said Eleanor. "But some things need their time." They looked at each other. The rain continued. The trees in the courtyard bent and straightened. The fountain in the center of the courtyard caught the water of the storm. Richard lifted the wet hair from her face with one hand. The gesture was new. Careful, like the first gesture of someone learning to touch something they don't want to break. Eleanor didn't pull away. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I am not in a hurry," she said quietly. "About anything. I just wanted you to know." "I know," he said. "And it is what I like most about you." They remained like that, in the doorway, with the storm passing over the estate, for a time that neither of them measured. The week after the storm was one of repairs and a particular calm that things have after a shaking. The storeroom roof was reinforced, the courtyard filled with branches and petals torn by the wind, which Thomas swept up 2 mornings running with his usual broom. The fountain in the center of the courtyard, which had caught the rainwater and overflowed slightly, was inspected by the blacksmith, and Richard, without anyone saying a word to him, sent for the plumber from the village. 2 days later, the courtyard fountain was running again. Eleanor heard it from the study, the sound of water over stone, clear and continuous, like something that had been waiting a very long time for that moment. She went out to the courtyard. The water flowed. It shone in the April morning. Richard was standing to one side, arms crossed, watching it. Eleanor walked over. She stood beside him. "Why now?" she asked. Richard looked at her sidelong. "Because it is time," he said. It was all that needed to be said. The months passed with the ease of seasons that follow one. Another without violence. Spring gave way to summer, and the summer was warm and long and full of work, of the harvests, of the August heat that came early and stayed late. But it was a different warmth from when Eleanor had first arrived. It was the warmth of a house that lives, not one that endures. The geraniums on the window ledges were watered again. Someone, no one could quite say who, though everyone suspected, planted new pots beside the entrance. The dining room was used more, for suppers on festival days, for lunches when the tenants came to discuss their agreements. The long, dark wooden table was no longer the place of 2 people at opposite ends. Richard and Eleanor had not rushed anything. They had given themselves the time they had silently promised one another, the time to grow towards something rather than fall into it. There were suppers and walks and long conversations and comfortable silences. There were moments when their hands met on the work table, and neither moved them away quickly. There were evenings beside the fire with the sweet wine and the fire that spoke in their place, and there were also difficult conversations, the ones that are necessary in every shared life. Richard told her one evening everything he had never told about Evelyn's death, the guilt, arriving back late from the fields, the empty chair beside the bed. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "You didn't arrive late. You arrived when you arrived, and you stayed until the end." Richard looked at her. "It is not enough," he said. "It never feels enough," said Eleanor. "That is the nature of love. It always seems as though we could have given more. But that doesn't mean what we gave was little." He was quiet for a long while. "I don't know whether I will ever stop feeling it," he said. "I don't think you have to stop feeling it," she said. "Only learn to live with it, which is different." Richard nodded slowly. "How do you know that?" Eleanor smiled, with that smile of hers that was never large but always honest. "Because I have spent years living with things that don't go away," she said, "and here I still am." He reached out his hand. He took hers on the table. He said nothing more. Nothing more was needed. Autumn came with the harvest, and with it an event no one had expected. Arthur Whitmore arrived at the estate one Tuesday morning, without notice, in a worn-down carriage with a young driver, who said nothing. Eleanor saw him arrive from the study window and felt something that was no longer the old fear. It was something closer to the serenity of one who has built solid ground beneath their feet and no longer fears the earth will shift. She went down to meet him in the courtyard. Arthur was older than she remembered. Less hair, more weight, and something in his expression that was the uncomfortable mixture of wounded pride and need. He looked at the manor with the gaze of men who measure what they do, not have. "Eleanor," he said, with the tone of someone reasserting ownership of something. "Father," she said, "would you like to come inside?" She led him to the sitting room. She asked for tea to be brought. She sat opposite him with her hands in her lap, upright and calm. Arthur spoke. He spoke of the family, of the worsening financial difficulties, of Catherine's husband who was not as good an administrator as he had seemed, of certain debts that remained unresolved. He spoke, in short, of money, though it took him quite some time to arrive at that point. Eleanor listened. "What do you want from me, Father?" she said at last, when he paused. Arthur shifted in his chair. "Mr. Ashford has means," he said, "and you have been here for over a year. I thought that by now I would have married him, so that you could borrow money from him," said Eleanor, with a calm that was more effective than any sharpness. Arthur stiffened. "Don't put it that way." "That is what you are saying," she said, "only with different words." A silence. "I was your daughter my whole life," said Eleanor, "and I served you well. I kept the house for years. I never complained. I never asked for anything that wasn't mine. And when you handed me over here as part of a deal, I accepted it because I had no other choice. But I have a choice now." Arthur looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between resentment and something that might be buried very deep. Shame. "The choice is this," she continued. "You may stay tonight if you need to, dine with us and rest. Tomorrow there is a carriage to the village that can take you, but I will not ask anything of Mr. Ashford on your behalf, and I will not be used as a bargaining piece again." Arthur opened his mouth. He closed it. "You are very hard," he said. "I am fair," said Eleanor, "which is different." At that moment, Richard entered. He had heard part of the conversation from the corridor, not because he had been listening on purpose, but because the house was not large and voices carried. He stopped in the doorway of the sitting room. He looked at Arthur, then he looked at Eleanor. "Everything all right?" he asked, addressing her, not the visitor. "Yes," said Eleanor. "My father is staying tonight. Tomorrow he takes the village carriage." Richard looked at Arthur with an expression that was neutral on the surface, but which contained, for one who could read it, a line that was not to be crossed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said with cool courtesy, "welcome." Arthur, who was a man who had learned to read power in other people's expressions, rose clumsily and made a gesture of greeting that was not exactly a bow, but came close. That evening, Arthur dined in silence. Richard and Eleanor talked between themselves about estate matters, the tenants, the state of the cellars. They included him in the conversation just enough that it wasn't a humiliation, but little enough for it to be clear where the center of that table lay. The next morning, before Arthur got into the carriage, Eleanor went out to say goodbye to him in the courtyard. Her father looked at her. In the morning light he seemed older still, and in some way smaller. "Are you happy here?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked her that, perhaps the first time in many years he had asked her anything to do with what she felt. Eleanor thought about it, not out of doubt, but because the question deserved an honest answer. "I am building something," she said, "which is better than being happy because it lasts longer." Arthur nodded. He didn't respond further. He climbed into the carriage. The young driver urged the horse on. Eleanor watched him go down the dirt road. She didn't cry. She felt no dramatic relief. She felt something simpler and deeper, the sensation of having said what was true, without cruelty and without fear. Then she turned and went back inside the manor. Richard was waiting for her in the courtyard, leaning against the arcade arch, a cup of tea in his hand. He didn't ask. There was no need. She took the tea from his hand, drank a sip, and they walked together to the study to begin the day. The weeks following Arthur's visit had a different quality to them, as though something that had been hanging in the air had been resolved, and the space it left could be filled with something else. Richard proposed one afternoon in October, not with ceremony or bended knee. That was not his way, and it was not Eleanor's. It was in the study, after finishing the review of the tenancy agreements for the following year, when they had both set down their pens on the table, and there was that particular calm of work completed. "I want to marry you," he said, using the easy, familiar tone they had adopted in the moments that were not formal. Eleanor looked at him. "I know," she said. "And?" "When?" Richard smiled. It was the smile Eleanor had watched grow over those months. Not the stored-away smile of the beginning, but one that no longer cost him to show. "Whenever you wish," he said. "Then, in spring," said Eleanor, "the apple blossom will be out. It is the most beautiful time." "In spring," he said. And they went back to the agreements. The wedding was held in April in the village church, with Reverend Edmund, who had known Eleanor since childhood and officiated with a genuine happiness evident in every word. It was a simple wedding, as both had wanted. Margaret was there, her bun as tight as ever, and an expression that, for her, represented the highest degree of emotion. Dorothy was there, having arrived 2 hours early to ensure that the wedding lunch afterwards was perfect. Thomas was there, wearing his Sunday suit with the look of one more nervous than the bride and groom. Lydia, the schoolteacher, was there, having made the journey specifically for the day, and who embraced Eleanor in the vestry with a strength that said more than any speech. Catherine was not there. Eleanor had written to invite her without pressure. Catherine replied with excuses of distance and her pregnancy. Eleanor understood without resentment. Some distances are geographical, others are of a different nature. Arthur was not there. Eleanor hadn't expected him to be. The ceremony was short and honest. Richard read his vows in his usual low voice without stumbling, with the simplicity that was his way of saying the things that mattered to him. Eleanor read hers, looking him in the eyes, with that calm of hers that was not indifference but depth. When Reverend Edmund declared them husband and wife, and Richard looked at her, there was in his green eyes something that Eleanor recognized because she had watched it grow for months. It was the expression of someone who has learned to trust life again, not without the memory of harm, not without the weight of the past, but in spite of all of that, and for that reason, with more courage. Eleanor took his hand, and they walked together toward the door of the church, where the April light and the scent of apple blossom waited for them. The years that followed were years of work and life built with the patience of those who know that the best things don't arrive all at once. The estate flourished, not spectacularly, but with the solidity of things well done. The north fields that Richard had neglected during his grief were recovered and let to young families who worked them well. The storeroom was properly rebuilt. The cellar, which had untapped potential, began producing a pressed oil that Richard sold that year at a better price than in previous years, thanks to the contacts Eleanor had quietly built over the autumn markets. The courtyard with the fountain was the visible heart of everything. The water always ran, the geraniums were tended, the trees bore fruit in winter and gave shade in summer. Dorothy remained in her kitchen with the same energy as ever. Thomas grew up and became the youngest head foreman the estate had ever had, and he was so with that mixture of gravity and loyalty that had characterized him since boyhood. Margaret retired a year after the wedding, though retired was not quite the right word, because she kept coming to the estate 3 days a week because, as she explained herself, she didn't know what to do with the rest of the time and found idleness irritating. Eleanor thanked her for staying with the sincerity that Margaret received with her usual expression of someone who doesn't quite know what to do with affection but accepts it. Richard learned slowly what it means to be present, not physically, that had never been his problem, but emotionally present, available, open to what was happening around him. He learned it from Eleanor, who did not teach it to him as a lesson, but simply by being as she was, attentive, honest, without unnecessary layers. And Eleanor learned, also slowly, that there is a difference between taking up as little space as possible, which is what she had done all her life, and taking up the space that was rightfully hers. That speaking is not always noise, that asking is not always imposing, that being seen is not a privilege but a human need as basic as water and bread. She learned this in the space Richard kept giving her, not all at once but continuously, with that constancy that is the most honest form of love. They had children. 2. First a girl, whom they named Constance, after Eleanor's mother, who arrived into the world on a December morning with a powerful voice and her father's green eyes. Then a boy, whom they named Edmund, after the vicar who had married them, which produced in Reverend Edmund himself an emotion so great he had to conceal it by coughing throughout the christening. Constance grew up with her mother's character, observant, precise, with that way of listening that makes people feel understood. Edmund grew up with his father's character, few words, great presence, an unconditional loyalty that was earned slowly, but once earned, was never lost. Both grew up at Ashford Manor, among the orchards and the old trees, with the fountain in the courtyard as the background sound of childhood and the smell of fresh-pressed oil each November as the smell of things that endure. There were difficulties, as there are in every real life. A year of drought that hit the grain harvest and required renegotiating several agreements. An illness of Richard's that for a few weeks had everyone holding their breath, a dispute with a northern tenant that required lengthy negotiations and the intervention of a solicitor from town, the gradual drift of Catherine, which never became a definitive rupture, but was a distance that never quite closed. But there were also the good things that are not recounted because they seem small and are not. The morning when Constance read her first book from cover to cover, and they celebrated in the kitchen with Dorothy. The winter when Richard taught Eleanor to ride the grey mare without needing the foreman to be nearby. The evenings in the courtyard arcade when the sun went down over the fields and the water of the fountain made its soft sound, and they were simply there, needing nothing more. One afternoon, many years later, Eleanor found in the back of the study drawer the letter her father had sent that first December at the manor. She read it again. The handwriting of a man who never quite knew how to keep his daughter close. The ink a little faded with time. She folded it carefully and put it back, not out of resentment, but because it was part of the story that had led her by a road she had not chosen, to a dark wooden gate with iron fittings, to a courtyard with a fountain that didn't run, to a man standing in the doorway with riding gloves in his hand and green eyes that didn't yet know what they were about to see. To a life she had not asked for, but which, with the time and the work, and the honesty that is required of things that matter, had ended up being hers, completely.